I don't think any of these bills could have passed if it were not for Teddy's willingness to put bipartisanship ahead of partisanship. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy famously said, "We must think and act not only for the moment, but for our time." I'm reminding of the story of a great French marshal who once asked his gardener to plant a tree. The gardener objected that the tree was slow growing and would not reach maturity for 100 years. The marshal replied, "In that case, there is no time to lose. Plant it this afternoon," unquote. The president's wisdom was not lost on his youngest brother. By force of will, driven by the sense of immediacy that he brought to every endeavor, Ted Kennedy had the ability to take actions today that might not bear fruit until a distant tomorrow. Like all good leaders, when he struck out on a mission, he was able to inspire many to follow him until the job was done, no matter how long it took or how hard the task was. That is not to suggest that working with Ted on a difficult piece of legislation was sheer drudgery, although sometimes it could be utterly fatiguing. More often, and this is what most of us who worked closely with him or against him will miss, Ted Kennedy would bring a sense of joy to even the most difficult, contentious legislative negotiating session. While many of my more conservative constituents have run me over the coals for just being willing to sit in the same room with Teddy Kennedy, the truth is that he and I didn't agree on much. We didn't agree on a lot of things. We sat next to each other in the Help Committee for the better part of 2 decades. Some may not remember this, but there was a time when smoking was allowed during the committee meetings and hearings. And during that time, you could always tell when Teddy and I were in an argument or were fighting by the amount of cigar smoke that he blew my way as a non-smoking Mormon. If there was a particularly strong disagreement, he would just sit back in his chair, puffing smoke my way, giving me an actual headache to go along with the political headaches he gave to all of us on the Republican side. Other times, in committee, on the floor, or even in the press, Teddy would lay into me with the harshest, red meat, liberal rhetoric you could imagine. But just minutes later, he'd come over and put his arm around me and ask, "How'd I do, Orrin?" I will not tell you every response that I made to him. Of course, this wasn't spiteful. Teddy just knew how to push people's buttons. It was one of the qualities that made him such an effective senator, and for those who were lucky enough to become his friends, it was a source of no small amount of laughter. It was in the late 1980s when I knew that I'd finally made it into Teddy's inner circle. I was working out in the Senate gym one day in December when Teddy came in and asked if I was going to be at his party that night. Now, I'm ashamed to admit that I'd been in the Senate for over a decade, and I hadn't heard about the annual Kennedy staff Christmas party. Those who have been to one or more of those parties will agree a different side of Teddy was often on display on those nights. At that first party I attended, Teddy came out and did a surprisingly accurate and hilarious impersonation of Elvis Presley. Tight jumpsuit and all. He looked awful as far as I was concerned. Then he joined the staff, performing skits making fun of Ronald Reagan, Dan Quayle, and even himself. It's really too bad that Teddy was never asked to host Saturday Night Live. But of course, serving in the Senate doesn't really leave you with enough time to do just that sort of thing. Just ask John McCain. Whenever Teddy and I would introduce a bill together, Teddy would tell reporters that if he and I were on the same bill, it was obvious that one of us hadn't read it. This always got a huge laugh, as it did just now, and I was usually just left there grinning, pretending it was the first time I've ever heard him say that. So one time I decided to come prepared. Right after Teddy made his remark, I pushed out a copy of the bill that was heavily highlighted and said, "Here you go, Ted. You can have my copy. The important parts are already underlined." I think Ted got a bigger laugh out of that than all of the reporters who were there. Well, complementing Teddy's sense of humor was his personal generosity. On one occasion, after a particularly late night in the Senate, I have to say that Teddy was feeling no pain at that time. He was with his friend Chris Dodd, my friend. I did what my former AA asked me to do. He called me one day, it was Frank Madsen, and he had just become the Mormon Church mission president in Boston, Massachusetts, presiding over 200 young Mormon missionaries. So when he called me, he said, Frank Madsen, he said, could I ask you a favor? And I said, sure. He said, would you be willing to come and speak to my 200 young missionaries up here in Boston? I said, well, for you, Frank, I will. He said, could I ask another favor? I said, sure. He said, would you ask Teddy Kennedy to come and speak too? I said, well, I said, I don't know. I said, but I'll ask him. He said, well, could I ask another favor? I said, my gosh, what's that? He said, will you ask Teddy to get Faneuil Hall for the meeting? I said, oh my goodness. I said, well, I'll ask him. So on this evening, when Teddy and Chris were feeling no pain, I walked off the floor, and Teddy put his arm around me, and he said, oh, Art, he said, I want you to come up to Hyannis Point. I want you to go sailing with me. Yes. And I want you to do this. Yes. I want you to do that. Yes. I said, great. I said, well, now, Teddy, I said, I have a favor to ask of you. He said, you do? He said, what's that? I said, do you remember Frank Madsen, my administrative assistant? He said, oh, yeah, good guy, good guy. I said, well, you know, he's asked that you and I come and speak to his... I said, he's now the mission president in the Mormon Church, over 200 young Mormon missionaries in Boston, Massachusetts, my hometown. And I said, yeah. Forgive me. I've asked Vicki to forgive me already, you know. He said, what about it? I said, well, how about he would like you and me to come up and speak to his 200 young missionaries. He says, done. Just like that. I said, well, I have another favor to ask of you for him. He says, what's that? I said, well, he would like you to get Faneuil Hall. He says, done. He said, so the next day I got into the office and I got this nice letter for Teddy and I got it over to him. And I saw him later in the day and he's holding that letter and his hands are shaking. And he said, Orrin, he said, what else did I agree to last night? I start selling these things, my eyes start to water, my nose starts to run, and it's just a mess, I'll tell you. But in any event, Teddy Kennedy and Orrin Hatch appeared before 200 young Mormon missionaries in Faneuil Hall, and they will never forget the tremendous altruistic talk that he gave to them on that day. Well,